Hello and welcome to the program. In Ukraine, the whole industry of film production is developing. Now there is an emerging a large coterie of talented actors, producers and scriptwriters. Movies made in Ukraine play a significant part in forging Ukraine's new progressive independent identity. Moreover, they're often critically acclaimed in different world festivals. Today we're going to talk about the international cooperation of Ukraine with foreign film directors. Joining us in the studio today to expand on this topic is Johnny O'Reilly, producer, film director and writer. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So first question, a bit of a personal question, if you don't mind. As far as I know, you moved to Kyiv last month. You lived in Moscow for 12 years. So why did you decide to live in Kyiv now?
Well, I was actually on my way to Russia to return there after having been away for about 2 years. And I decided to give Kyiv a go early in August, partly because, you know, the political situation in Kiev is kind of very much contrasting with Russia at the moment. So for a filmmaker, it's a bit easier to make movies of the kind that I'm interested in here than in Russia at the moment. So there's quite a lot of censorship at the moment in Russia. And also, on the broader level, I'm just interested and excited about being here right now because it feels that all the stars are aligned for Ukraine to really kind of push forward and, you know, for the government here to make meaningful, lasting reforms. And it's just an exciting time to be here.
Now, just to come back a little bit on Russia topic, how to overcome the obstacle of censorship when you're a Western director, when you're used to a certain different way of filming? How do you overcome that kind of obstacles?
Well, I mean, the censorship isn't as bad as one may believe in Russia. And it's something that really only exists within people. It's not so much an edict from on top. It's more about self-censorship. And you just often come across distributors or producers who are a bit uneasy about being associated with certain types of narratives. It's not to say that, you know, the KGB are following you everywhere and making sure that you don't do this or that, you know. So but unfortunately, you know, since the invasion of Ukraine and since the sanctions that have subsequently been put on Russia, the political atmosphere in Russia has gotten worse. And there's a lot more pretty extreme nationalism in the media. And unfortunately, people who are media owners there, they feel that the wind is blowing in a certain way and they have to blow with that wind in order to win the bids that they're tendering for from the government.
So people are voluntarily avoiding certain topics or avoiding...
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Now, you grew up in Ireland, studied Russian and classic at Trinity College in Dublin, and you worked as a journalist in Russia and Ireland before studying out as a filmmaker. What brought you there? What brought you to filmmaking?
Well, I always wanted to be a filmmaker even before I started learning Russian. But I was very lucky to learn Russian at a time when the country was finally opening itself up to the world. So when I went to Russia as a student, aged 21, it was 1993, the year of the constitutional crisis, when Yeltsin amassed all, you know, all the tanks to blow up the White House. And for a young man kind of seeking adventure in the world, there was nothing more exciting than that. Now, obviously, it was a tragic event for Russia, but for me as a kind of a budding journalist, that was a real turning point for me in terms of what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. So after that, you know, I learned the language of Russian and always looked for excuses to go back. Went back a few times in the 1990s. And then 2016 went back with a film script that was set in Moscow to do a rewrite and ended up staying 10 years.
Now, you've been, as we said, living in Russia since. Did you observe a shift after the invasion of Crimea? Did you observe some changes in atmosphere and some sort of evolution?
Yeah, there was a shift, of course. Yeah, I mean, three things happened. Firstly, you know, Russia found itself at war. Secondly, the sanctions were put in place, and thirdly, the price of oil went down really fast. So those three things contributed to, economic stagnation in Russia, and it affected everyone I know in terms of labor mobility, but in particular, the media in Russia changed a lot, and a lot of my kind of liberal friends over there were feeling a bit less comfortable about living there.
Now, to come back to Ukraine, you said earlier in the interview that the film industry, the stars are aligning. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Well, I think the stars are aligning not just in the film business here. I think, there's something that I've observed a bit in this region. I mean, within both Russia and Ukraine, and I guess in a way it's an attitude towards democracy. Because there's still this feeling here, and certainly in Russia, that democracy is like an innovation of the West, or that it's something new, that it's only been around for the 20th century. But the fact is that democracy is older than religion. It started 700 years before Christ. And it's something in the West, even in secular societies, that we consider to be sacred in a way. Mm-hmm. And like the altar of democracy is a free and fair election. And one of the real reasons that I came here was because Zelensky secured 73% in those elections. So when you have such a huge mandate in a free and fair election, it instantly creates political stability. If you look at what's happened with Brexit, for example, you have 52 versus 48. The reason there's so many problems there is because that vote was so
polarizing.
It was so close. Mm-hmm. And it's also one of the reasons why in previous iterations of revolutions or big changes in Ukraine, I think a lot of people here still are feeling a bit too cautiously optimistic, I believe, because they've had that feeling before where there's a new government, things are about to change, and then it never works out. But the big difference is that Zelensky has united the country, and that 73%, that figure itself is almost a guarantee of political stability in the medium term.
Now, one of the big events recently in Ukraine was the release of political prisoners. In 2015, while having an interview with a Russian television radio, you supported director Oleg Sentsov, which was at that time jailed. Now, fortunately, Oleg Sentsov is free. What do you think this means for the film industry in general, for Ukraine in general? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a great thing emotionally for the people of Ukraine, because everyone in the country has lived with the image and the feeling that their people are in prison, and, obviously very unfairly and for political reasons. And so to have those 17 people repatriated was obviously a great release and a great relief for the whole country. So on an emotional level, it's really important. But I think on a political level, it's also very important because it shows that this new government is able to do deals with the Russian government. And it's the first step in what everyone hopes will be, a full rapprochement between the two countries.
Now, as a filmmaker, we talked a little bit about Ukraine's film industry, but I would stress that there is a phenomenon in Ukraine as more and more movies are hitting international box office. How do you explain that mechanism? Do you think there's some sort of proper Ukrainian style which is emerging? How do you perceive it?
Well, I think there are a few reasons why that's happening. And it's funny, it's also happening in Russia as well. So I think there's one reason is just generally younger people are getting better educated at filmmaking processes. Your typical 24-year-old nowadays has had access to all of the world movies on, on their computer for the last 10 years, while people my age might not have had that film education at that age. So that's one reason. I think another reason is that the industry in both countries collapsed in the 1990s. So anyone who picked up where they left off in the 90s after the 2000, there was no mentors who were able to show them how to do things, you know, because that whole period in the 90s, there was no film production. So now again, you have people in their 20s who are learning much more quickly than people in their 30s or 40s would have, because the mentorship has existed for them. And also we are surrounded by screens everywhere we go. So, you know, anyone nowadays growing up in their 20s, they're already used to visual storytelling by making little videos, you know. So it's just something that becomes more natural for people. And in general, just wherever you go, there's always going to be an improvement in quality of output, but in particular in the digital sphere, because technology is pushing it forward so quickly. So I think that those are the kind of main reasons why the quality of output is improving here. And I suspect it's going to improve a lot more quickly as well in the subsequent years.
Now, concerning the specific case of Ukraine, it also helps create, let's say, an identity, a narrative for the country, especially since 2014. You had movies like Kyiv and all these movies around the war.
Yeah.
And do you say, because a while ago in this same exact studio we discussed with a producer who was explaining us about the danger of patriotic movies and somehow that it could potentially not erase, but asphyxiate some sort of creation, this idea of being willing to do only patriotic movies. What's your stance on that?
Well, it's very interesting because, like in Ireland, where I'm from, and in most Western European countries, you would not have money going to a movie because it's patriotic. You know, the fact that it may be patriotic is coincidental to the criteria that should be the reason why a movie is chosen for funding, and that's really its objective quality. So, but I know that there is a big movement here, a nationalist movement, and I know that the country is just emerging from a war. So I do believe that, you know, look, patriotic movies are here to stay, so there's no use arguing against them in a sense. But I think there's something important here, I think, about the area of identity. And across all government policy, you know, this idea of identity is informing important decisions. And a lot of decision makers, I believe, search for reasons to emphasize a national identity in what they already know, the folkloric traditions, the clothing of the, you know, ancient peasants, the old songs. You know, those are the things that are easy to kind of put forward as emblems of your national identity. But the real thing that's going to create a modern identity is to encourage young people to be creative and to use their own individual voice. You know, like in Ireland, I remember in the 1990s, we, like Ukraine, had you know, my whole life, the first 20 years, we had a war up in Northern Ireland, and also we were one of the poorest regions in Europe. But then we had you know, it wasn't so much a tech revolution, but we had a very big tiger economy in the mid-90s. But what that coincided with was with the band U2 becoming the biggest band in the world. So you can imagine just coming out of university at that age, when suddenly, you know, you're living in the coolest city in the world, and everyone has heard about you because of this band, who were the coolest band in the world at the time, you know. So that coincided with a really strong economy for the first time in my life. And that was where the modern identity of Ireland started to be built, you know. And so I think when people are talking about identity in Ukraine, it's not going to be something that's, you know, rehashed from the past. It's going to be the way that young people now project themselves individually and collectively onto the world stage. And the way to do that is just to encourage young people to be creative, you know, design programs for young people to be mentored in the arts. And I think that's all going to happen over the next few years.
Now, and to conclude this interview, what we saw what Ukraine can learn from the West. What can the West learn from Ukraine here? And for quick words.
There's so much, you know, like how you treat old people is actually something that we can learn in the West. You know, there are obviously great family traditions here of taking care and living with older people. So that's certainly one thing. I think there's a really good work ethic here, you know, and it shows in the first and second educational systems, not so much the third educational systems, but you know, I think the schools here are very high quality. But also I think there's an openness here to create and for an openness for new ideas. And I think that's something that's very welcome.
Well, thank you very much for this overview and for coming in our studio to talk about your career and your relation with Ukraine and Russia. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today.
Great, thanks.
That was Tony O'Reilly, producer, film director and writer. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.